It's so nice to see some of your faces, and then the most of you, your black squares. But I'm very happy to see so many of you here, and I want to say that that the reason why we have this conversation is that John Michael has been to Poland, and he has made friends in Poland. Okay, so and we have people not only from Warsaw but from Wrocław and Lublin, in all different places, which is a wonderful thing. I think one of the good things about the pandemic. Okay, but anyway, so let me say hello once again to John Michael Werner, and I would like to tell you a couple of things about him. Okay, so he is an art historian trained in gender and women's studies. He is assistant professor at Kent State University in Ohio, the USA. He teaches histories and theories of contemporary art, feminist and queer art and theory, and contemporary photography, and also environmental art history. And he does it from a feminist and queer perspective. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and art history from the University of Colorado, at Colorado Springs, a master's degree in art history from Arizona State University, and a PhD in art history and a minor in gender and women's studies from the University of Arizona. He published in 2018 his first manuscript, Border Spaces, the US-Mexico Frontera, and it came from the University of Arizona Press. and in January 2020, right, which is like a year ago, he was awarded an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Confluence Center Frontalidades Fellowship, which I know that he started carrying out, but I don't know if he has finished because of the pandemic. And now he's finishing a manuscript on, well, actually the running phase, right, fence, which is the topic of today's presentation. His research interests include border and borderland studies, land use studies, eco-critical studies, theories of modern sculpture, social relational art, and theorizing publics. Okay, this is everything I wanted to say by way of introduction. And now I would like everybody to know that we will be recording the talk. Okay, so, so I'm pressing the, oh, Anya, it just says that I have to ask the host.
I have already pressed the record button.
Oh, okay, you did it. Okay, wonderful.
John Michael, welcome. And right, so the lecture will be recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded when speaking, please turn off your camera when asking questions, and you will be able to ask questions after the talk. You may also use the chat to ask questions throughout the lecture, and we'll have a look at them at the end.
That sounds like a great plan. Thank you so much, Justyna and Anya, for having me. I am really excited to be with you today. I, of course, wish I was there in Warsaw with you, but I'm thankful that we can use the technology that we have to bring us together despite our geographic distances. So I'm thankful for the technology that can help us grow and think collectively to really think about knowledge production as something that we can do as a group. So my topic today is running fence. Let me get the PowerPoint set up. So, can everybody see the PowerPoint okay?
Yes.
And it looks okay now? Can you see me as well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. So what I want to talk about today is the running fence, which is the topic of that second book. But I want to approach it in a couple different ways. One, I want to acknowledge the running fence is something that is material, something that is physical, something that can be touched and held. But I also want to acknowledge an aesthetic realm that is beyond the material, that is social. And the way that I'm going to kind of ask some of these questions will be through the business enterprise, the Running Fence Corporation. The Running Fence Corporation was the business entity formally incorporated that was responsible for any legal affairs as well as any affairs of state, community, etc. So a slightly different entrance into Running Fence. Let me just get started. I have the PowerPoint up on another computer here so that I can see it because I have way more slides than I need. So we'll see how that goes. All right, inside the Running Fence Corporation. In 1972, passing through Los Angeles, Christo and Jeanne-Claude boarded a plane for Australia. I should say too, before I go any further, this is a 3-part talk and I did it in 3 separate parts so that we can have a breath of air in between each part. Or if I am too long-winded, then I can just cut one of those parts out and we can go right to Q&A. So take that for what you will. In 1972, passing through Los Angeles, Christo and Jeanne-Claude boarded a plane for Australia. The artists were en route to Sydney. It was then that the artists caught their first glimpse of California. As much as a history of Running Fence is unruly, it is a regional history, a history of the local and the public, and a chronicler of social structure and world order. Sometimes referred to in conjunction with its subtitles, Project for the West Coast of the United States, Project for Sonoma County and Marin County, or simply the Project for California, which is my favorite. I see each is a descriptive title that more fully accounts for the layered complexity of the artwork beyond its obvious spatial and physical materialization. In an effort to address the richness of Christo and Jeanne-Claude's project, this visual and cultural history recounts artists' entanglements from 1972 forward, gleans the Artist Commission Environmental Report, and carefully culls the 1976 public installation. Running Fence references directly and indirectly related events, such as the controversy surrounding the proposed Bodega Bay nuclear power plant, the dedication of the Valley Ford Post Office flagpole, which was made from a portion of the fence, the establishment of public land trusts and land use coding that protect small farmers from Bay Area development, and even reparations returning ancestral land to the Kayesha people, all came out of this project, either directly or indirectly. When viewed as a palimpsest, when Running Fence is viewed as a palimpsest or endless horizon of non-hierarchical space, Running Fence becomes a demastered history that references conventions of landscape representation, avant-garde art tendencies in the visual arts, and a post-war art history that is defined as much by what it is rather than what it is not. I couldn't not bring this picture. I had to bring it in. I'm going to show lots and lots of ephemera today, but what you're looking at on the bottom rectangle are bridesmaids at a wedding, and they're wearing dresses made from the fabric of Running Fence, right? So we're really talking about Running Fence in its broadest way, right? This is the clothing they made from the fabric of the fence and wore it at a wedding, right? You can see there was a little bit of vandalism at one point. That's the smaller box here. And then of course, you can see the artists. There's Christo right there, one of the farmers. Give you a sense of the project. Made from industrial fabric and mass-produced architectural materials, Running Fence draws from everyday objects synonymous with industrial American progress, including manufactured steel poles, cables, and synthetic fabric. At 18 feet tall and 24.5 miles long, Running Fence is a gigantic land artwork made iconic by photographs and films of the 1976 installation. Installed temporarily, the barely 2-week installation ran through public and protected spaces, grazed ranch land, poultry You ever just look at your page? Oh, here we go. Grazed ranchland and poultry and dairy farms. It connected public buildings and landmarks from post offices to community grocery stores, and it intersected with numerous roads, bridges, and highways, including the prominent California 101. In addition to public discourse, artistic process, and rurality or location, as well as the installation, Running Fence is a snapshot of community. And this is another way that we can talk about the slide that's on the screen. Not only is this the reuse of the material, but this is also an aesthetic shaped by the relational interactions between the people involved with Running Fence. In addition to public discourse, artistic process, and rurality or location, as well as the installation, Running Fence is a snapshot of community. Claiming Running Fence created community or forged an existing community anew is unclear and misses the point. In fact, some of the ranchers, day laborers, environmentalists, local residents, art enthusiasts, politicians, and others initially connected by the project still maintain a communal identity today. Many knew one another before involvement in the project for California. The methodological approach that I'm using today to approach Running Fence serves the important role of situating the installation in time and space, but it is by no means a reflection of the artist's intention or purpose. If anything, the various threads of Running Fence direct attention to the tremendous power that art plays in socioeconomic and socio-political public spheres. Let's see here. Beyond the contemporary moment, I bet you didn't expect to see 19th century landscape painting at a Running Fence talk. Beyond the contemporary moment, Christo and Jeanne-Claude could be said to interrogate well-known representations of the frontier, such as Thomas Cole's The Oxbow, the full title, The Oxbow, View from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts After a Thunderstorm. That's the painting on the left there. And Emanuel Leutz's Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. That's the image on the right. By the way, the image on the right is in the Capitol. And if you look at some of the images of the rioters who broke into the Capitol, you can actually see this mural on the wall in one point, which is very interesting. So beyond the contemporary moment, Christo and Jeanne-Claude could be said to interrogate well-known representations of the frontier, such as Thomas Cole's The Oxbow and Emanuel Leutz's Westward, the Course of Empire, and examine symbols of progress as well as their historical and contemporary significance. As a form of public land art, Running Fence thoughtfully engages natural and people-built environments, as well as histories representing the Western frontier. In fact, it was the first land-based project with an environmental study analyzing the impact of the installation on the landscape and nearby communities. It conducted it by specialists in their field. Running Fence embraces a vision of the local and develops aesthetics referencing specific and regional geography, as well as treats histories of land use as suspect. Powerfully and creatively, Running Fence indexes state and imagined community, human and natural time, geography, and geology. In addition to an art historical layer of meaning, Christo and Jeanne-Claude questioned the tradition and convention, the relationship of economics to cultural production, and aesthetics informed by place and environment, all emerge salient, As you can see, I'm talking in this introduction about Running Fence in its broadest constitution, right? Both the material thing, its historical outreach, and the people involved with it. In The West is America, Reinterpreting Images of the Frontier, art historian William Treutner unpacks the philosophical underpinnings of westward expansion and its representation in the American West. He notes the importance of the frontier and asserts westward expansion and migration shaped social and political institutions for much of the 19th century, and they still do today. Treutner explains that art histories of national expansion, quote, disguise the problems of a nation in transition, America shedding its heritage as a wilderness republic and establishing itself as an industrial democracy. For example, he also argues that reinterpretations of art and visual culture at the American West unearth less visible and often inaudible histories inscribed in the landscape. This is an older exhibition from the early 90s at the Smithsonian, and I found it so incredible for a variety of reasons. One, it's talking about the 19th century, but I could easily have substituted the 20th century at many points in the book because there are so many overlaps between the last half of the 19th century and the last half of the 20th century. It's also an interesting catalog, and I recommend, if you haven't seen it, to check it out because it was very controversial when it first came out. It was controversial because people had idealized and romanticized the American West such that it really didn't exist as anything but mythology. And what William Trutner did in the exhibition and in this book was to say, wait, we need to take a fresh look at this. We need to see the other side or the other issues involved with depictions of wilderness. For example, Trutner wrote, quote, "What has been lost in the process of taming the West with well-recognized symbols of progress? The wild prairie becomes a cultivated farm, steamboats enliven a lonely stretch of river, religion, re-Christianity, and learning replace the backward ways of the Indian, and so on," end quote. It is this point of erasure which has been lost in the face of nationalism and what was buried by the capitalist state where Running Fence intervenes. Running Fence uses land as a point of retrieval in which one can rethink heteronormative masculinity and assumptions. That's something that I do in a completely different chapter of Running Fence, but I wanted to throw that out there in case there was any interesting conversation. In The West is America, Trutner articulates the art and visual culture of the rapidly expanding frontier is of the gravest importance to understanding the American West. He wrote, "Images of the frontier are among the most potent and moving invented by American artists during the 19th century. Decade after decade, they return with new force and meaning for our national life. So efficiently do they function as ideological statements that we grasp their import without even realizing it, making them devastating as hidden persuaders, but even more intriguing as works of art," end quote. Sorting through the sometimes moralizing underbelly of representations of the North American landscape, Trutner maintained the ideological forces of state production and national identity were drawn from a commonly held belief in American exceptionalism. Consequently, Edenic representations, examples of that would be right here. Edenic representations of North America were readily understood and accepted without question by 19th century audiences. Throughout the West of America, West as America, Trutner reinterpreted progress narratives, nationalist worldviews, and queried what he described as, quote, "the moving frontier," or a continually growing and expanding impression or consciousness of the American West. Treating Running Fence as only a 2-week project, as only a 2-week installation, neglects, I argue, the project for California as an interlocutor, one serving between the histories of the past and the histories of the present. In other words, and I don't say this very eloquently, but Running Fence as has been studied over and over and over as land art, right? It usually comes up in art history around land art or public art. And I think that's an interesting debate, but that's not what I'm engaged in. I'm engaged in the people, right? So in the first part of this paper, I tried to locate the work within some of the scholarship, including William Trutner, and to make an argument that Running Fence is material and immaterial, but also to make the argument that Running Fence is much broader and bigger than what we understand, what we think. All right, so the second part of this paper, examining a matrix of female leadership, and this is a tidbit, just a tidbit of the book that I'm finishing up. Examining a matrix of female leadership and the general erasure of labor in Christo and Jeanne-Claude's Running Fence, a project for California, reveals a complex system of socioeconomic and socio-political cultural production. In the article, "The Fence, Total Art Experience," Santa Rosa Press Democrat art critic Peter Golis spoke with Christo as the artist unfolded an assortment of legal documents, engineer's drawings, and sketches. Christo said, and I quote, all this dealing with farmers and government officers, all these human relations, I consider the work of art. This quote reveals the scope and depth of Running Fence. Human relationships are as essential to understanding the project for California as study of the 1976 two-week installation. It also makes plain Jeanne-Claude, chief executive of the Running Fence Corporation, and Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, associate director, as well as other employees and figures crucial to Running Fence that were overshadowed. By means of incorporation, Chief Executive Jeanne-Claude navigated multiple state and environmental systems needed to secure building contracts and construction permits, from official letterhead to an environmental impact report, personal correspondence, and family albums. The second part of this paper will examine the material culture associated with the Running Fence Corporation specifically, and glean oral histories in an effort to foreground unseen labor. As much as the iconic two-week, 24.5-mile installation is significant to the history of art, Running Fence is also a snapshot, as I will demonstrate, of people, place, and time. The second half of this presentation will begin with an abbreviated analysis of the primary published archive. One of the reasons why I asked if you can see me is I brought it with me. And you can see it's absolutely massive. You'll see as I talk about it, it is in its own right a work of art, but you can see, I know it's hard to see, I have a picture in the PowerPoint, but you can see it's signed and numbered by Christo, and it also includes a piece of the fabric. So a lot of thought and a lot of work went into this particular catalog. And this is common of Christo and Jeanne-Claude in that they publish everything they want you to know in a book as an archive, rather than working with scholars and community members. They just put it all out there, or at least that's what they claim to do. So I'll start with an abbreviated analysis of the primary published archive, Calvin Tompkins, Christo, Running Fence, Sonoma and Marin counties. And notice the title, right? It's Christo's Running Fence. Jeanne-Claude is not there, right? I analyzed this curated volume in order to make legible key actors, including Jeanne-Claude and Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, and their relational, socially engaged practice. Prompted by their leadership, I turned to Running Fence employees and volunteers and activists. I approached direct participants as empowered through shared personal and lived experiences, which is a reflection of Jeanne-Claude's social engagement. I just love that picture. I think it's really fantastic. On the far left, the workers in their helmets unfurling the fabric. The picture in the middle, another one of the workers running the guide wires that would support the tall fence poles that you see in the far right picture. Calvin Tompkins' book is one trace of people, time, and place. It is a curated and selected archive constructed and executed by Tompkins and authorized by Christo. It is a limited edition autographed volume. Presumably, the inner workings of the Running Fence Corporation are found within. Consider representations of Jeanne-Claude. At times, she is more muse than collaborator. In fact, Tompkins routinely lacks reference to Christo's partner, who was the chief executive officer of the Running Fence Corporation, as well as any hint of the substantive participation of ranchers, art lovers, students from Sonoma State University, and politicians. Because, and I think this is fairly fair to say, because Christo is always the center of history. He is the artist genius, right? And so part of this project is to unwrite the existing histories that focus on the two-week project and rewrite a history that includes a variety of the people involved, which of course this book doesn't do. Consider also Lynn Hirschman-Leeson's depiction. Hirschman-Leeson participation may come as a surprise to many, despite the fact that she lived in Sonoma and Marin counties over 3 years as the associate director of the Running Fence Corporation. Keeping memory that Tompkins' Running Fence is authorized by Christo, Hirschman-Leeson appears early on, but only by default on Running Fence Corporation letterhead. In a recent 2008 interview, Hirschman-Leeson responded in conversation with me to this erasure. She wrote, quote, "It was difficult to be left out of the documentation. I worked tirelessly and I was at everything." On the screen is a letter referencing Hirschman-Leeson. It is one of the only places she is directly referenced. I just lost my train here. Let's see. It is one of the only places where she is directly referenced. Regarding female leadership and women's labor in general, turning to the Running Fence Corporation proves key to unearthing socially engaged dynamics. So this is an example of the letterhead, and you can see up here on top, I need to move these pictures real quick. You can see up here on top, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson appears on the letterhead, right? She isn't directly referenced or acknowledged and rarely appears, and when she does, it's in one essay. So she's a very small figure in Calvin Tompkins' book, despite the fact that she was there for 3 years, 3 of the 4 years to build the project. It was Jeanne-Claude who initiated meetings with ranchers, politicians, and activists, and even hosted community dinners after major milestones. She led the project for California and arguably carried the weight of Running Fence. All the while, Jeanne-Claude had Hirschman-Leeson by her side. In fact, if it wasn't for Hirschman-Leeson's willingness to share her personal history, the artist's physical and creative labor would be essentially lost. In the space created by their leadership, direct participants were empowered, and today, many share personal and lived experiences. And I want to show you one more letter. This is the letter from, this is an exchange between Calvin Tompkins and Hirschman-Leeson. And the part that I have pulled out of it is, you can see here, been feeling badly about not answering your mailgrams, letters, and cards, which I've been enjoying hugely, and feeling worse to learn you've been in the hospital. Hope that's well in the past by now and fading from memory. You're much too young and vivid for hospitals, even on visits. So the first thing he does, right, is recall the trope of the sick, panicked artist, right, or female artist specifically, right? Also been meaning to tell you that I've restored you to the Christo saga, right? So he had this mighty power to restore her when he left her out. Like the way that masculinity is exercised in this letter is just unbelievable. I've been meaning to tell you that I've restored you to the Christo saga. In the version of my piece that will appear in the Big Abrams book, which is the one we've been talking about, in retrospect, I'm quite displeased with myself for letting it get cut out of the New Yorker. I've had any number of letters quite properly scolding me for leaving you out, and one extremely angry letter from Peter Seltz demanding to know how I dared to leave him out, which I answered rather unkindly, but with mirth. And that, of course, fits with Seltz's personality even still today. I have another tidbit I want to show you. This is a copy of a draft book that Bert Chernow, Christo's biographer, was putting together. The reason I brought this in is in the original version of the book, or they edited the original version of the book, and what I want to show here is Jeanne-Claude, April 6, 1994. She's crossed out, right? You go through this whole piece of paper, and almost every role that she had, she's crossed out. Now, I'm not saying she's absent, but I'm saying she's diminished in the way that we talk about Running Fence. And when we refocus and talk about the Running Fence Corporation, right, then we begin to see people like Jeanne-Claude or Lynn Hirschman-Leeson. All right. This next one's just for fun. For example, in 1970, Christo. For example, in 1972, Jeanne-Claude met Lester and Amelia Brune after she selected, and this is Lester and Amelia Brune right here, and this is Christo right there. So this is in one of the local newspaper accounts. In 1972, Jeanne-Claude met Lester and Amelia Brune after she selected the Bloomfield Town Hall as a personal residence and home office. The Brunes raised sheep nearby. They quickly became friends upon whom the artist relied time and again. After the Board of Supervisors denied the approval of a building permit, Lester Brune rescued the project for California from an apparent dead end. He took on the role of educator, teaching the artist about life in the rural reaches of Sonoma and Marin counties. Marianne Brune, daughter of Lester and Amelia, and I have a picture of her here. Isn't this a beautiful landscape? This is Marianne Brune there in the foreground. Marianne is a fourth-generation Californian. Her family immigrated to the United States and moved to California in search of a better life, a very common narrative. She grew up hearing her parents, especially her father, Lester and Amelia, right here, right, hearing her father. She grew up hearing her father speak against corporate-owned farms. Marianne remembers that her father deeply resented entities, including government and corporations, making decisions about the use of family property. For Lester, the Brune family was a local business, and it represented the family's security and dream of a better life. So what you're looking at is their farm. And in this picture, you can actually see the homestead or the house, and then the land surrounding it that was the Brune family homestead. Even it is filled, oh, no. For Lester Brune, the Brune family ranch was a local business, and it represented his family's security and dream of a better life. Marianne's mother, Amelia, kept a photo album of running fence and their life with the artist. It is filled with personal snapshots, including a photograph of her father. Check this out. This is really cool in the top left up there, including a photograph of her father leaning proudly against the installation. And of course, this is in their backyard. The installation was in their backyard. Additionally, the albums are records of events that have occurred since the land artwork was deinstalled, including the establishment of the Christo and Jeanne-Claude Museum, which is in the Valley Ford Post Office. This is absolutely spectacular. If there's ever a question about whether art can impact someone, this is a town of about 250 people, right? And they had so much fun, or they felt running fence was so influential on them that they converted the lobby of their tiny little post office into a museum. So you can see the walls there are covered with posters and photographs and letterhead, any memorabilia you can imagine associated to Christo and Jeanne-Claude. Think about the smallest town you go to, right? A town with no museums, a town that has one school, right? That's Valley Ford, and this is the post office, and this is a really tremendous thing that they've accomplished. Photographs range from family dinners with Christo and Jeanne-Claude to community gatherings with Hirschman Leeson after important civic meetings and decades of ephemera revolving around a sculptural installation that barely lasted 2 weeks, which for the Brunes resulted in lifelong friendships. Even after her parents passed away, Marianne kept correspondence with the artist. Just the other day, she mentioned to me writing, and I am in regular contact with her. Just the other day, she mentioned writing Christmas cards she mentioned that they would write Christmas cards to one another, but after Jeanne-Claude passed away, responses were few and far between. Again, that's just another small way of making the point that all of the communication, or the bulk of the communication, was going through Jeanne-Claude, right, not Christo. And so a big part of community comes through the Running Fence Corporation and Jeanne-Claude's work therein. If Marianne were here today, she would express her affections for Christo are as great as Jeanne-Claude, but their interactions were of a different nature. One, Jeanne-Claude, was more relationship driven, and Christo, who was more project driven. Along with the albums, Marianne held onto a tablecloth and coat into which her mother used a portion of running fence and wove symbols of family, health, and nourishment. So like the dresses I showed at the beginning of the presentation, farmers all over were reusing the fence and the fabric of the fence. The fence poles became fence poles on farms, so they were reused. The fabric was used to cover hay bales to keep them dry. But here you can see where her family made a tablecloth on the right and a coat. She's holding a coat made of the fence in the middle. And then on the far left, you can see her mom and dad, Lester and Amelia Brune, holding the coat. Along with the albums, Marianne held onto a tablecloth and coat into which her mother used a portion of running fence and wove symbols of family, health, and nourishment. They serve as keepsakes of her mother's loving hand. The Brune home was an environment laden with notions of family business, the importance of land and commerce, the challenges of government and ranching, and the family's history of migration. The Running Fence Corporation stitches together these day-to-day lived experiences. Through the Running Fence Corporation, Jeanne-Claude collaborated with the Brune family and helped forge deep, lifelong, lasting friendships. Marian Gray had a very different experience with running fence. In Berkeley in the early 1970s, she attended a presentation about the proposed monumental project. She was immediately inspired and remembers her lengthy discussions with Jeanne-Claude. Gray still speaks affectionately. In our conversations, she reminisces about waking up at 5 in the morning for Christo and Jeanne-Claude's update. And then boarding trucks to travel to the designated areas. As if it were yesterday, Gray looks back on the California hills shimmering in the light and the rolling fog painted red, yellow, and pink by the sunrise and sunset. She closes her eyes and vividly remembers how the salt air smelled. She remembers those who were involved, from the artist's friends to Bay Area young people, as well as college professors and students from Sonoma State. She even remarked once in conversation, even the Hells Angels volunteered. For Gray, this experience represented a historical moment, not only the art historical event that became Running Fence, but an embodiment of the political dynamic and cultural fabric of the 1970s United States. Most of all, Gray felt acknowledged, recognized, and that she was part of a large friendship circle. Still today, Gray identifies with Running Fence. She refers to herself as a hooker, or a person who hooked the nylon to the cables and frames that was eventually unfurled. Gray even remembers when Tom Golden opened his home in Fremont as the unofficial social headquarters and coined the term hooker. In regard to unseen labor, Brune and Gray's oral histories demonstrate a formidable feminism, understated in Tompkins' manuscript, but wherein Jeanne-Claude and Hirschman Leeson are crucial to the realization of Running Fence. These interviews reveal the sociality of Christo and Jeanne-Claude's project and stress the importance of lived experience. Inasmuch as Jeanne-Claude and Hirschman Leeson's feminism foregrounds female experiences and female leadership, their direction underscores the everyday and ordinary, where the Brunes, Gray, and others live and work regardless of acknowledgement and participation. So we'll move on here from the hookers. Then there's Bill Cordon, the lone county supervisor who voted against the sculpture, a decision he made to, quote, symbolically challenge equally careless land use decisions in Sonoma County's past history. He felt a no vote by the supervisors would have signaled the county's resolve to respect rural landscapes. Although Cordon was outvoted, he raised important red flags. He reminds us that even though Running Fence was accompanied by an environmental impact report, the artists were not environmentalists themselves. To ensure coastal protection and preservation, activists, many tied to the Sierra Club, filed a last-minute injunction to prevent the project from moving forward. And here's a picture, an older picture for sure, I guess not, it's just 1987, but you can see Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Boxer, Michael Fisher, who was the head of the Sierra Club in California at the time, the debates that were raging. Again, I'm not saying that in this picture, all that they were talking about is running fence, but they were talking about the environment. They were talking about how incursions in the landscape can mess up the small farmers' projects, can mess up the agricultural work that was being done. Cordon passed away in 2014, but not before acknowledging his attempt to stop Christo and Jeanne-Claude may have inadvertently contributed to the preservation of natural areas and the codes that have prevented the sale and takeover of many small farms and ranches. Public outrage was useful for framing much needed discourses of environmental activism and organizing, which in the end encouraged statewide ballot initiatives, including the establishment of the California Coastal Commission. Another thing that came out of Running Fence that I think is very important is land was returned to the Kayesha people. Although it is, and this is one of the most fragile parts of the landscape that I'm showing you on the screen here that Running Fence went through. That delta, if you will, is fresh water running into the Pacific Ocean, running into Bodega Bay. The Kayesha people didn't have access to their land for hundreds of years. They had been kept off their land from the first Russian immigration, then the subsequent Spanish invasion, and then the Americans, the United States, right? One thing after another led to being barred from your home or homeland. Although it is a complex determining the links to the 1976 project, it is clearer when Cordon and others share their story. Beagle Brodsky was employed by the Running Fence Corporation, and he helped construct the Running Fence installation. Brodsky erected posts and frames that were bolstered with stakes and cables. When Beagle helped deinstall the installation, he took on the responsibility of making sure there was no remnant, not even a stake. He proudly explained, "We couldn't leave anything behind, nothing, because animals might hurt themselves." Through his employment with the Running Fence Corporation, Brodsky met the Benedetti family, a relationship that would last a lifetime. Back in 1976, Running Fence crossed the Benedetti property, and it is through the mini culture of Running Fence, borrowing Brian O'Doherty's language, that he befriended the Benedettis. Later, he served as a manager at Willie Bird Turkeys, a deli that serves prized turkey meat direct from the Benedetti family farm. So not only in the case of Beagle, I didn't mention this, but he got his paperwork. He was able to become a documented immigrant through Running Fence. And he was able to, through Running Fence, meet the family that would ultimately provide him a job for the rest of his life. As the artist's lawyer, Ed Anderson, represented Christo and Jeanne-Claude through lawsuits and city and county injunctions as he attended to the affairs of the Running Fence Corporation. Anderson remembers when the artist first approached him, quote, "Whatever reservations I had, Christo told me my only responsibility was to get a favorable vote. I assumed Christo and Jeanne-Claude would also want me to help them get the required easements from the 59 ranchers. I knew most of the ranchers from speaking at many of the potluck dinners at Granges in the area, and it seemed highly unlikely that they would ever consider such a thing as this fence, a project with no use or purpose that would remain up for just 2 weeks and then removed within 30 days. Although Anderson was hired primarily to navigate the county supervisory boards, in the end, he managed contacts with ranchers and construction companies, as well as general day-to-day legal assistance for the Running Fence Corporation. When I began researching Running Fence in 2011, I quickly became affiliated with the project. And it is through those experiences that I have learned of Jeanne-Claude's influence, as well as countless others, some of whom have since passed away. Over nearly a decade in the field, I have learned immeasurably from those who retold their stories. With Joe in the aisle at the supermarket, and in conversation with Roz at the post office. Marianne and I drove what felt like, and I remember this very clearly, every time, I guess. Marianne and I drove what felt like every dirt road and a few paved ones, stopping to greet a neighbor and hear their story or gaze across a beautiful landscape. After a long day, she dropped me off at the campground where I stayed, recording equipment in hand and battery long since expired. I started this project as part of my dissertation, so I only had the money that was provided to me through my stipend. So I was camping. I wasn't staying in hotels. I had to find a place I could live for a long time and not spend a bunch of money. So I ended up in this campground, and Marianne Brune taking me all over town. Marianne and I drove what felt like every dirt road and a few paved ones, stopping to greet a neighbor and hear their story or gaze across a beautiful landscape. After a long day, she dropped me off at the campground where I stayed, recording equipment in hand and battery long since expired. Today, Marianne Gray is a photographer and lives in San Francisco. And I remember the first time I met her. She was moving from one studio to another, and I was somehow enlisted to carry boxes. I later learned the boxes were filled with items symbolic of Gray's lifelong friendship with Jeanne-Claude. I first met Beagle Brodsky and Willie Benedetti at Willie Bird Turkey's deli. They prepared me a sandwich mounding with turkey, and I had to admit, I don't eat meat. On the screen is a photo of the pair unveiling their panel, their selection of the running fence. I think this is a really tremendous photograph because you can see the two friends here, Willie and Beagle. You can see the fabric of the fence. This is a 2013 photograph. And knowing that his family was able to forge, well, I lost my slide, was able to forge a friendship at Willie Bird Turkey's. I just think is absolutely incredible. Although I was not present at Bill Cordon's funeral, I sat with him when he was battling cancer. He didn't give up without fighting, both for his life and against running fence. Throughout our friendship, he repeatedly asked me, "Are you sure you want to write a book about this?" And in the same breath, he would quietly admit his memories of Jeanne-Claude. Regarding Ed Anderson, his Alzheimer's grew progressively worse, and eventually our conversations turned to skiing and his enduring love of his wife, Sharon. There are many more stories to tell that emphasize sociality and the relational dynamics of Christo and Jeanne-Claude's iconic project. Although I haven't met the employees at Rubber Crafters in Smith Mill, West Virginia yet, I would be remiss if I failed to acknowledge the factory workers which sewed the fabric panels that gave the physical installation shape. Recognizing unseen labor, often closely tied to the Running Fence Corporation, requires personal testimonies. It is my sincere hope that this snapshot of Running Fence, a project for California, and more specifically, the Running Fence Corporation, managed by the CEO, Jeanne-Claude, and the Associate Director, Hirschman Leeson, unearths how the aesthetics of sociality make visible and heard the Chief Executive Officer and the Associate Director, ranchers like Lester and Amelia, their daughter, Marianne, volunteers like Marion, Running Fence employees like Beagle and Willie, and even their lawyer, Ed. So that's the end of my second part. I have a third part here. Are you guys up for a little bit more? Are you done? This one, it's not very long, so it's a short part. The third part, so in the first part, I tried to locate the project within some of the literature. In the second part, I tried to unpack some of these oral histories and the way that the oral histories begin to actually describe an aesthetic, begin to actually reveal a social dynamic that occurred in part because of this fence, which is very, very extraordinary. And it was the Running Fence Corporation that did that. In the last part here, in the last part of my presentation, I just wanted to give an overview of the book. A couple people have asked me about it, so I thought I would just put in an overview of what the book is, where this fits in the presentation that you've seen, and what else is it that I'm working on that I can answer questions about if you would like. When viewed from an endless, non-hierarchical horizon, Running Fence reinterprets the Western reaches of the North American visual and conceptual landscape, as well as points to many cultures, traditions, and history. Laying bare the policies and practices of an ever-expanding American West, Christo's theoretical interpretation of the frontier foregrounded indigenous, colonial, and national histories of the American West. Running Fence rethinks traditional narratives of art and the history of the Western frontier, and the intellectual and art historical dynamics of state production and economic expansion. Undoubtedly, Running Fence is the shining and meandering path to the sea, the path of progress and divine right mediated by natural order and human law. In 1976, Running Fence occupied rural farm and ranch land, as well as the landscape that was historically an indigenous homeland. True to many 19th century landscapes, the two-week installation is spectacular and leaves the viewer awestruck. Beyond its deceptive installation, however, there are real places, ordinary lives, day-to-day economics, and the meeting of migrant communities. Running Fence borrows and unravels the pictorial rhetoric of nation and nationalism established by well-known 19th century American landscapes. It rethinks everyday visual and consumer culture in the context of the American West. And the artists address the peoples and histories that were largely displaced by the forces of US nationalism. In short, this California artwork signals an expanded understanding of landscape art in the United States and a practice imagined anew. Organized around 4 chapters, each communicate in different ways, Running Fence is a trace of the American past, often overlooked, but still embedded in the present. Interpreting the surfaces, textures, and crevices of Running Fence as narrative and aesthetic space reveals a complex imagining of, as Trutner said, the West as America. Running Fence reinterprets historical art and visual culture of the Western frontier and examines its continuing relevance today. It is remarkable how relevant Running Fence is just 50 years later. The same issues regarding land, government, and incorporation are as important today as they were to Running Fence in 1976. In the first chapter, Foregrounding Dirt and Soil, I deconstruct the wilderness paradigm, but this time through the annals of the Project for California. Beginning with Thomas Cole's The Oxbow and Emanuel Leutz's Westward the Course of Empire, the search for dirt and soil lends itself to a far more complex vision of Running Fence. From an imaginary hike that I take, from hiking with Thomas Cole to racist and heteronormative masculinity, the first chapter situates Running Fence as a benefactor of the hegemonic past and an image of the peopled present. I have a couple things here. This is the free weekly in San Francisco called The City, and this was in 1976, and you can see that they wrote or drew an image of Running Fence right onto the landscape, the Bay of San Francisco there, but they put a face, eyes and a nose and a mouth right here onto Running Fence, that embodiment. There was that immediate acknowledgement of people, right? That landscape paintings have historically embodied a nation, right? The landscape becomes the picture of the nation. In the context of Running Fence, the picture becomes the people, right? The people. Chapter 2, oh, and one more image here. This is 2010. And if you look, I have to move these pictures again. Okay, if you look here, this is Jeanne-Claude right here, and this is Christo, and Marianne Brune is right here, right here. And this is an exhibition that they put up on a shed in the park where they had this picnic. I'm sharing this with you because I want to show you how Running Fence is different than the way that we talk about traditional landscapes. And one way that it's different is the artists and the community remained engaged with the project until their death, which is pretty remarkable. Chapter 2 discusses Running Fence beyond the visual and ideological constructs of American landscape painting. In Their Eyes, Rural Knowledges, I explore how Christo and Jeanne-Claude cope with the 19th century convention of bodies and land, which depicts the transformed landscape as an allegorical portrait of the United States. I will turn to a series of oral histories, some of which I shared with you today, from the late 2010s. The second chapter articulates ordinary and commonplace experiences and stories, lived histories associated with the palimpsestic running fence. Through the artist's visual aesthetic, the veneer of historical landscape representation is exposed, and a local history of place and community emerges through Christo and Jeanne-Claude's land use. In chapter 3, Traces of Incorporation at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries argues that running fence unearths visual and historical formulations of gender and race. In the third chapter, I labor to include women in leadership positions, factory workers in West Virginia, Christo and Jeanne-Claude's groupies, and so forth, absent in many of the histories of running fence. As in chapters 1 and 2, I attempt to shift the focus away from the architectural and sculptural land art form to a critical view of Christo as a trademark or brand. I aim to decenter materiality and bring forth the lived experiences of Jeanne-Claude and Lynn Hirschman-Leeson as they were directed connectly to the Running Fence Corporation. I also posit the importance of labor in general, including employees of the Running Fence Corporation and the workers who sewed the fabric together, prepared the steel architecture needed at the time of installation. Whether Christo's treatment of Jeanne-Claude was an informal agreement between the artists, or whether Running Fence is yet another example of female artists overshadowed, studying the artist's processes and methods through the lens of incorporation, in which development rapidly transformed the wilderness into civilization, links the US history of the American West and subsequent frontier representations to Christo and Jeanne-Claude's California art. And the reason I have these pictures up here, for those of you that study 19th century American art, you know both of these images, the golden spike on the left and John Gass' American Progress. I have these in here because I compare Running Fence to images of incorporation in the 19th century with images of incorporation, the fence, that is, incorporation in the 20th century. So one of the ways that we look at the West as America is through that 19th century lens of incorporation. In chapter 4, I unearthed the concept. Oh, and I almost forgot. I have a couple, here's a few more examples. This is some of the ephemera that appears in that chapter about incorporation. This is the fence, the Running Fence lease agreement. And again, you had to have a corporation in order to have these legally defined documents. I also find things like just a list, right, of Christo and Jeanne-Claude's visitings or appointments with some of the ranchers, with some of the farmers. You can see here, this was early on when they were trying to really figure out the path of the fence and who lived there. So these are some of the names and their locations along what would be the fence. One day would be the fence right over here. The entire contract, I never thought I would be reading financial data, but I worked through these different contracts. In chapter 4, I unearthed the concept of geomorphic histories through a 1906 map of California. Signed by M. Solon, the cartographic map was drawn for the California Earthquake Commission, a state body established after the Great San Francisco earthquake. The map depicts roads, bridges, cities, and towns, and geographies thought to be indigenous homeland alongside fault lines that produce seismic energy and determine both the Earth's outer shell and human eras. Through Christo and Jeanne-Claude's aesthetic reference to geologic and human time, earthquakes disrupts the logic of progress as well as frontier expansion and migration. Since Running Fence digs deeper than the rubric of human time, the chapter explores the visual and cultural dynamics of California's earthquakes. Ultimately, Christo and Jeanne-Claude trace a millennia of natural catastrophes, many of which are still readily identifiable in California's geography, as well as the turn of 20th century photography. So let me show you a couple of these earthquake pictures, because that's definitely the weirdest part of the project. So here's the map from 1906 from the Earthquake Commission. All the different fields of color are different native groups, right? And then if we were close, it would be much easier to see. You can see all the roads, bridges, and the ultimate fault line that runs right through California. And by the way, this is Bodega Bay up here. Guess where the San Andreas Fault ducks out into the Pacific Ocean? Bodega Bay, right? Coincidence? Yes, the artist did not plan that. It wasn't their intent, but it just shows how earthquakes permeate California, California's identity. So I also look at some of the photographs that come out of that Earthquake Commission. For example, wrinkles. I actually just talked about this in one of my classes, where they tried to personify the land. So the land, instead of being damaged by the earthquakes, now just had a few wrinkles. It's a little bit older, right? They were imagining the landscape either in the title, or if you look on the right here, Gorman Station, how they imagined the landscape as a way to depict survival. This slope right here was part of an earthquake that caused this sloping land, but they took the picture in such a way as not to focus only on the slope, but the house that survived, the house that's in the distance that managed to remain standing. And then I look at the environmental impact report, and I look at what it says about earthquakes, right? This is very, very fun. And really different, something I would love to share sometime. And last of all, that record of seismic activity in Sonoma and Marin counties. This was part of the testing that the artists had to do in order to get approvals for running fence. Each of the 4 chapters trace how Christo and Jeanne-Claude could be said to reinterpret US representations of the landscape through their interest in time, place, and environment, and sustained engagement with community. Running Fence critically engages with artistic convention, state construction, capitalism, and cultural production, and the construction of race, gender, and sexuality. This is my cat making an appearance. That's her tail right there. As Trutner explained historical representations of the Western frontier as national pictures, so too Running Fence reinterprets historical images of the American West through an emphasis on community and place rather than nation building and nationalism. Running Fence is an example of Trutner's revisioning of the national picture, and therefore not surprising that for the last 50 years, the artists have gleaned the region through a series of realized and in progress projects in the region. And that's all that I have for you today. I'm happy to take questions about Running Fence, about the book, about my argument. If you want to talk about the inauguration and the insurrection at the Capitol, here in the whatever you want to talk about, I'm more than happy to entertain questions.
I think that first of all, we need to say thank you. Thank you so much. I feel ashamed right now because, it happens so that sometimes I show my students images of the Running Fence. And I had no idea it went, from east to west. I always thought it went, from south to east, or, from north to south, or the other way around. So, I love that part. And actually, some of the paintings that you showed us, I showed them to my students, and I hope that some of them are with us today, and and they are able to make connections. Wonderful, thank you so very much. I don't know, right? Would anybody like to say anything at this point? Would anybody, I don't know, maybe make some comments, right? Even before we started asking questions.
Yeah, can I?
Absolutely, and hello.
Hello, thank you, John Michael, for this fascinating investigation. I would call it an investigation of sorts into the behind the scenes of Christo's and Jeanne-Claude's project. I particularly like how you contextualize this discussion, how you provide the 19th century history of looking at the American West. And to tell you the truth, I was really happy to see John Gast's American Progress, because I thought of this image when you showed images of workers, and there was one image of a worker with a and that of John Gast. And I like the change of perspective of how you bring the discussion of an art project to a completely different level. So you certainly made me think about many issues in connection with land art, which I always understood as helping us to see human impact on the land. Whereas here you discuss, among other things, you discuss the artwork's impact on humans. Now, is Running Fence exceptional in this respect, would you say? What about other projects by Christo and Jeanne-Claude? What about other land artists? What about, I don't know, Robert Smithson, Nancy Holt, Dennis Oppenheim? And would a similar kind of examination work in similar ways, would you say?
Oh, that's a great question. I do think that Running Fence is unique in this kind of larger discussion of land art. And I try to, in many ways, pull Running Fence out of that discussion, because when we talk about Robert Smithson or Dennis Oppenheim or Nancy Holt or some of the other land artists that you mentioned, while they're interested in the 19th century convention of the wilderness and bringing people from urban Los Angeles, let's say, out into the middle of nowhere, out into the desert to see these gigantic projects to better understand the earth and natural history, et cetera, that's very different, as you pointed out, than Running Fence, right? At least how I see it, at least how I'm arguing it here. In terms of the rest of the artist projects, yes and no. In my read of Christo and Jeanne-Claude, just as a generalization, they are making participatory works. Each of their projects, the big projects anyway, manage to engage not just a large public audience, but also the local government, right? The local museums. Christo and Jeanne-Claude would always come and do lectures when they were starting a new project. I don't think it's as extensive as it is in Running Fence on all of their projects, but I do think this is something that's consistent in their work. Did I answer all of your question?
Yes, yes, which is obvious in a way, because they have to have all those permissions and agreements, and they have to collaborate with the local authorities and with the local people. So in a way, a geographical location would matter here a lot. I mean, if you are attracted to vast, open, sublime emptiness, spaces of the American West, it's a different story than when you, for instance, pursue a project like this in Berlin, obviously.
The Rapt Reichstag.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, thank you. What was your name?
Edita Frelich.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks.
Well, Edita is not a student, right? She's faculty at the, well, what is the name in English, Edita? The name of your university in English? You call it?
Wierzchowska Curie University in Lublin. MC, or UMCS, as we know it.
I've actually
a Lubliner here waiting in line, I think, Evelina.
Yes.
Justyna, can I ask a question and a comment on John Michael's work?
Absolutely. Right.
Thank you very much. John Michael, so nice to see you. Long time no see. Again, thank you for this beautiful presentation. I'm so happy, and welcome, Gertrude. I do love I mean, in the book that you're going to publish and in the presentation, and I absolutely love this focus or doing justice to the project by shifting focus from this controlled gaze that we see in the archive of the project, right? Because this is also an imagined vision of the project that we have, right? And aestheticized, right? And so in a way, he's interpreting or critically looking at history, but also with a very subjective, his own Christo's vision, right? And what you are doing is adding this vibrant, unstable, sometimes difficult to control archive, not a staticized archive, right, of all of those voices, right, that are sometimes, you know, they escape any definition, right, in the second, I mean, this kind of localized archive that you have, right, that says a lot about the people-centered part of the project. And I think that this is so important, probably possible to be done with a certain distance, historical distance, right, and in time distance, right, because you can see what is missing, right, you can talk to people, maybe also talk with people who have also distance to the project itself, right, but in a way justice is being done to art itself, created at that time through adding those missing elements, right, to the entire puzzle. In a way, I think that it's still, the fence is still running, right, in this way, that it is running through your work, right, through those archives that are still there, right, probably will be there when we uncover in 20 years later some other works, you know, material being remade again, right, it's still a living, to me, a living project, right? So thank you for that, because I absolutely enjoyed that part, and seeing it from this perspective of the voices, right? Unheard, right? Gender-based as well, right? Or race-based voices, because that adds, that's seeing project as a whole as well, the additional archive, right, or adding to the archive, right, so it says a lot about the power also in the archive itself, right, in the original one, and what you add to it, right. So thank you very much for the work and for all that you have presented.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Evelina. I appreciate it.
You mentioned the question, Evelina. Did you mention?
No,
I
want to right now ask the question. Speaking of the, since John Michael mentioned the inauguration, right, and what is happening, I was wondering, and doing justice, right, to this project, do you see this actually, your own work that you are doing on this project, right, as engaging us in a discussion of what is happening right now, especially in the US, right? Speaking of exactly gender, race based issues, environmental issues, how this particular artwork can help unravel certain things, or do you see it useful, especially nowadays?
I do think it's useful, and I think it can help in very concrete ways. When a work of art can exist for 2 weeks, but then exist from 1972 to present, right, all at the same time, it can exist for 2 weeks as a material thing, and it can exist in time and perpetuity, if you will, as a breathing, living project, right? The problem is, generationally, not all the generations are excited about running fence anymore. Marianne Brune's children don't even care about it. They actually threw away some of the stuff that their mother had saved for them from her time on running fence. So the archive, if you will, of voices is changing and dying. So that's part of the urgency of this project too, is to acknowledge some of the major actors in the project for California before they pass away, so that we have an archive that we can keep returning to over and over. Most of the research, Evelina, is all just looking through newspapers, sitting down with people involved in the fence. I mean, it was very, very, the people's interactions were very fun. The going through newspaper after newspaper from 50 years ago, that wasn't fun, but that's what we've got.
Thank you very much.
You know, one thing which came to my head, and there may be a link with what is going on in the States right now, because maybe I don't understand it in the right way, but the way it seems to me is that the shape of the fence came like the actual shape of the fence depended on the agreements that they could get, right? That those people, they had to say, yes, you can place it on my land, whichever way, right? Sometimes they were just individual people. Sometimes I imagine they were institutions, right? But this is, this is how it came to be. But then, was it the case that those people, in fact, they were saying yes to not being able to travel for those 2 weeks, because you couldn't, like go through the fence, right? Like the fence was in fact dividing them for 2 weeks, right? For 2 weeks, like they were cut off, right? Some of them were on the, let me do the directions, on the southern side of the fence, and then some of them were on the northern side, right? And the way I see it, it went all the way to the ocean, right? So it cut them off. So do we know anything about that aspect?
Absolutely.
Also,
because running fence in 1976 crossed so many roads and bridges and public parks and ranch land, they had to figure out a way for the artist to make the fence such that it wouldn't function as a divisionary force or a dividing force. And I'll give you an example of that. They stopped the fence at Highway 101. It broke for 50 feet, and then they continued the fence on the other side of that, right? When we talk about downtown Valley Ford, the fence went right through downtown, and they stopped it at that main square between the supermarket and the post office. So on individual farms, there were places where the fabric was pulled back like a curtain, so that the farm animals, cattle and sheepdogs and so forth, could run through or at least walk through. So there was an acknowledgement of what a fence is and the dynamics of what a fence projects. So I think it does divide people, but I don't think it does it in the way that we think. I don't think it does it in a conventional way. I don't think it's separating one person on one side of the fence and one person on another, because you could travel through both ways, because whether you were on a public road or on a ranch.
That is very interesting. Very, very interesting to me. Mm-hmm.
The permeability of the fence in itself.
Yeah, right. Because I was thinking about the Mexican border, right? And all the stuff which went, on with it, especially with Trump in power, and right, because right, as I said, I didn't know it went from east to west or from west to east, whichever way, right, but like this way. So now, I'm trying to make all different connections. Fascinating.
Even this slide, Justyna, is the path of running fence. The yellow line was the original proposed direction of running fence, right? And you can see, if you look closely at all the different ranches, and the names of the families are still there. And then this green line is the native land, or what is now today the native land. But it was at that time a protected site. And they got in trouble, they got sued. And were fined several $1 million for actually putting the fence into the ocean.
And they paid it?
They did.
Or was it? They didn't.
They did pay it. They did pay it.
They did pay it.
They paid it through the Running Fence Corporation. They had to be sued, right? You had to have some kind of a legal entity, and so that became the role of the corporation, or at least one of them.
And did they know that they were risking paying so much money, when they put the fence there, or they didn't realize it?
They knew exactly what they did, even though they've said at times differently. What happened is there was a last-minute injunction just days before the fence was supposed to be completely up and open to the public. And I just lost my train of thought, Justyna.
It was about the suing, right? That they went into that protected area.
Just days before the fence was permanently installed, members of the Sierra Club went to court and tried to get a legal injunction to prevent the artists from installing the fence into the ocean. They didn't want the artists to touch the coastline, right? In reality, Christo and Jeanne-Claude just put the fence right down into the ocean. They completely ignored the injunction, the legal report, everything. They just did what they wanted, and that's why they were fined. That's why they were fined. In fact, the Sierra Club, when they found out that Christo and Jeanne-Claude had put up the fence anyway, the Sierra Club wanted them to take it down. And the judge said, no, there's no point in taking it down because that would cause more traffic, more impact on the fragile coast that you're trying to protect. So, but they still had to pay the fine.
So what is it? It sounds like a strange story, right? That you have two white people, you know, who actually violate, you know, this in a way which, you know, echoes what happened in the past, right? So it runs counter to this whole, you know, like sociality and criticism, you know, and all that stuff. That is quite unsettling, right? It sounds.
That's why I think it is so interesting to see it from the perspective, to see what was happening, how in a way the project itself repeated some of the problems that it tackled as well, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so useful. You know, Evelina, you had talked about how can we think about the running fence today and what's going on today. I think when we study the social dynamics around running fence, we get a better understanding of why things are the way they are, at least in this particular community. And so questions about race, questions about gender, questions about sexuality or citizenship, that comes up in the day-to-day still, right? When I very first time I interviewed Beagle Brodsky, who worked at Willy Bird Turkeys, he told me that he was undocumented, right? That he had never told anybody except Jeanne-Claude, because she got him the work permits. So there are things that come out, in this case, the inequity of citizenship, right? And what that means, things can come out still today that are relevant and point to current events, if you will.
So one more question concerning that, because you mentioned at the very beginning that it is not certain whether they agreed, Jeanne-Claude, right, and Christo, whether they agreed that he would be the prominent figure, right? And she was doing the, you know, social aspect of that. Do you think that now, knowing that maybe some of the workers were undocumented, that maybe that was omitted on purpose, that some of the work would not be commented on, right? For that reasons, do you think that might be also one? I mean, we can speculate, I assume, right? Because we will never know now, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Beagle had never mentioned citizenship in regard to the running fence before I asked him the question. And I just asked him the question because he had an accent. And I thought, oh, found out he was from Australia. And then that opened up a kind of question in my mind about other potentially undocumented workers.
Right.
Justyna, do any of your students have questions? I don't
Yeah,
want to
exactly. This is what I was going to ask, but I feel a little guilty because we've been asking so many questions that I don't know. You know, people, please, okay, students, dear students, okay. Do you have any questions or any comments? Is there anything you would like to know? Please.
And you may use the chat to ask your questions.
Also, or you can also talk, right? Whichever way you would like to do it. You're very welcome.
So I will make a short comment, hopefully, when we are waiting for the questions. So John Michael, thank you for the presentation. It's amazing how differently now I see the project. I took part in the preparation for of the poster for your talk, and I looked up the images, and they represented they represented running fence without any people. So you had these limitless landscapes of the American West, and the way that you have uncovered this unseen labor from this Marxist and feminist perspective is just amazing. So it's thank you so much. It's a talk that I think many our students will find relevant, and they will be able to relate it to what we are doing in other classes and other talks.
Excellent. Excellent. I'm happy to hear that. And thank you for the feedback, Anya.
I think that, I think that on one of the helmets, in one of the pictures, I think it was a woman, but it doesn't matter. There were these letters spread marks. Did I see it correct?
And people's fans.
Yeah.
Right. Another interesting dynamic, speaking of these pictures, right, and how, John Michael, how you talked about how different people responded to that. It's interesting to me to see how students felt liberated, and how community was formed. How different social problems were or emerged depending really on the social status of the people or of the life, right? How different people responded to that because of their social environment, right? Because of certain freedoms they had or they did not, right? So I think that is also an interesting area, right, to explore, to see the approaches to the project depending on really on who you were, right, or what you could allow yourself to do in the area or within the area of the project, or participating in the project. So just one more comment.
Thank you, Evelina.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I would still like to try to encourage the students. Hello.
Someone wrote into the chat box, is this the same Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House? Yes, yeah. That's the same Nancy Pelosi.
Mm-hmm.
That was me. So can you, hi, hello. Could you then explain what she was doing there? Like, what was her role? Or was there a role, or was this an accident that she was there?
She didn't have a formal role. She was a politician in San Francisco at the time. And so her interactions with the Sierra Club were an effort to generate the green vote, the environmental vote. And so she was asked, what do you think of this? But she didn't hold a particularly prominent role, or she was never employed. She never volunteered, anything like that. But she was part of the I guess you could say, the operating board, if you will, in terms of deciding what can and can't happen.
Also, because I was chatting with other students, and we kind of agreed that I think we kind of lack the context of this whole running fence. Like, it kind of, for me, it kind of came out of nowhere, to be honest. And like, could you just maybe provide a little bit of like background for this? Like, where does it come from at all? And this, yes, sorry.
No problem, no. So you're asking me what is the general info about running fence?
Yeah, and also like, because I understand this is an artistic installation, was it like a part of any other movements, or yeah, where did the idea come from?
That's great. It's also a difficult question too, but I will do my best. So the project was something that the artists had always wanted to do. They wanted to do something in the West. They had already done a small project in Kansas City, the wrapped sidewalks. They had done a project in Colorado called the Valley Curtain. And after Running Fence, they did the umbrellas in California. So there were quite a few projects that they worked on in the West, which was deliberate, absolutely intended. Once Christo and Jeanne-Claude moved to New York, they didn't move out. So they had to make a short-term residence in the West when they would do their projects. In terms of just kind of general information, in 1972, the artists were scoping the land. They were flying up and down the coast trying to find the best place possible. And they narrowed it down to 3 places, and the third was Bodega Bay. The first 2 were more in Central California, and that's where they went back years later and did the umbrellas. So that place wasn't abandoned. It was just used for another project. It's about 25 miles long. It's a little bit more, but it's about 25 miles long, or was. It was up for 2 weeks. All of the poles and all of the cables had to be tested architecturally. So they're all designed by architects and engineers as if you were building a house. They had to use the Running Fence Corporation and those engineers and architects in order to craft those contracts, those agreements, right? What else could I tell you about the fence? I think in terms of contemporaries, one of your professors mentioned other land art. And I do think that Running Fence comes up when we talk about land art. So that would be like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, or Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels, or Michael Heitzer's Double Negative, or Walter de Maria's Lightning Field, right? These big, massive earth, dirt-based projects, right? That exist in the American West. I tried to argue that I think Running Fence is a little different, right? That it doesn't necessarily fit conveniently in that mold of being land art. Certainly there are aspects of it that resonate, but I don't think it's quite the same thing. I think it's more of a social project. They spent 4 years getting ready, constantly going up against legal battles, but eventually got permission. It happened to be 1976, which was the same year as the bicentennial of the United States, so 1776 to 1976. So they made a deal out of that as well. There was this one scene where they were in a wagon, an old school Wells Fargo wagon and horse-drawn wagon, and they were riding along the fence as if they were reenacting frontier days, which is very interesting too. Does that answer your question, or would you like a little more?
Yeah, I guess more or less. Thank you. Thank you very much.
By the way, I'm afraid we have to finish, because look, it is already 2:49 in Poland. So, you know, we should have finished 4 minutes ago. You know, unless somebody wants to ask a question, you know, like a quick question, quick last question. Hello, students?
So I'm sorry. Okay, it's working right now. So
Yes.
I read in the article that it was demolished after the 14 days, and there was no traces left behind. And it's interesting for me because normally after artistic installations, normally they leave something to remember. Mm-hmm. And it was completely abolished from the place. And why do you think that is? Is there any idea behind it, or it was just like spontaneously?
Well, one, this is common with Christo and Jeanne-Claude, that their projects are short-term. The big installations that they do, whether it's in a park or a state building or a bridge, they tend to last for a short period of time. So that's just one of the ways that they operate. I do think, though, the fact that it's a temporary fence makes a difference. I do think that makes a difference, because it becomes almost like a beacon, right? It shines and it lights and it pulls you in, and you want to know more, because it doesn't really make sense as a fence, right? It's just a cloth of fabric running across the landscape. So you want to know more, and that immediately pulls you in. That immediately, I think, engages you. Time is also an element that I talk about in the book, in contrast to the landscape paintings and photographs, that we talk about landscape paintings and photographs as being examples of time and place in a single composition, right? Running Fence is also time and place, but not in a single composition, right? So it's expanding that traditional rubric that we use to evaluate landscape art as an example of time and place. It makes the place someplace that's geographic and is moving. It makes the time something that begins in 2002 and arguably still continues today, right? So time does have a place in the project. That's a great question.
I'm sorry, but as my view of art in general, I think there is always should be this remaining of remembrance. So we should leave at least some traces behind in order to inspire the future art. And I think they could have left at least a piece of clothes after this installation, or at least one part of it, and just demolish it all.
One of the outcomes of the project were all the pieces of the project, the cable, the poles, the fabric, they were all reused. The first person who got them was the farmer. If the farmer wanted those poles or wanted the fabric, and most of them did, they'd use these giant swaths of fabric to cover the hay to keep it fresh. They would use the poles to reinforce their own fence poles around the farm. So while it didn't exist for more than 2 weeks in the land, it does continue to exist today. There are material components. In fact, if you go to the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the only thing they have of running fence are photographs, and they have the poles, the cables, the lines, the hooks. They have those material things that were taken out of the ground. But again, I don't think that really tells the story.
I don't think either.
Yeah, I am so very sorry, but we need to finish. I'm afraid.
Thank you for your question.
Maybe next time, we'll need to arrange, to have more time, right? Maybe 2 hours, and then we could do it. Okay, so what should I say? Once again, thank you so very much. Also, thank you, the audience. I think that, I hope that even, those of you who were quiet, that you found it interesting, that you got to know new stuff, and, maybe you will do your own reading, research, right, to find out about defense. So Anya, would you like to say something also?
Well, just repeat mostly what you have said. So John Michael, thank you so much for the presentation. I have enjoyed it, and I'm sure that our students have enjoyed it as well. Many of them begin their next class in 5 minutes. So I think that, yes, this is the point that all have to end.
Thank you,
Yes.
everybody.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. All right, you guys, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
It was really great. Really, I really enjoyed it, and I'm really sure that our students as well, and the images that you have shown as well should resonate with them. When I teach transcendentalism, I show them those 19th century images of nature and landscape painting. So I'm sure that we're able to make connections. And Justyna, when she teaches art, I'm sure shows even more of these. So
well, I show them exactly, among the paintings they show them, I show them exactly the two that you've shown. So, I was just, like, I hope that, some of those students are in the audience. So, yeah. Okay, so, Evelina, would you like to turn on the, yes. Okay.
I just stayed for a moment because I knew that it was so nice to see Justyna and John Michael together. I mean, we cannot see each other in person, right, like that, but it's so nice to see you. I'm so happy. And now Anya included, right, that this continues really, because this is all about, this is a running fence kind of the dialogue, right? So I'm so happy to see all of you, and thank you very much, Justyna, for organizing that, and John Michael for
the two of us actually,
yes.
Anya also did
Thank you, thank you so much. So that's a fantastic thing. That
speaking of collaborations, right?
Exactly. That's
now I feel that I have to read more, right? Because actually I am curious why Christo and Jeanne-Claude, why they were so adamant, about bringing the defense to the ocean and, kind of ignoring the will of those people. So, I am curious and I want to find out, and maybe I will.
Well, that can be a
Okay.
conversation we continue having.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to meet you. It's just a real pleasure, and I know you worked hard on this, so thank you.
No, thank you also. And yeah, I think that we have to try